Hats are great knitting projects. They are small, portable, and don't use that much yarn, so they are great for stash busting. They're also a great way to try new techniques and stitch patterns like the pattern on this hat, a simple slip stitch cable pattern. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. You want to knit your first hat but you're not quite sure how to get started? Well, knit along with me as we knit this beanie. We'll start with casting on and work through everything in the pattern all the way to binding off. You'll find the pattern link down below, so get your yarn, your needles, and grab that pattern and let's start knitting. Let's start by casting on, and I'm going to use the cable cast on, but you can use any cast on that you like for hat knitting. So it starts with a slip knot, and I'm going to wrap the yarn around my fingers twice and then pull that second loop through, and that will create a slip knot. Very simple way, but any method you like will work here. Then we need to put another stitch on the needle to get us set up. So we're going to use the knit cast on method. So hold that slip knot needle in your left hand and the empty needle in your right. You're going to insert, wrap the yarn and pull it through just like you're creating a knit stitch, but you're going to put it on the left needle with that slip knot. So then you'll have 2 stitches on your needle. From this point, we're all ready to start our cable cast on. So we're going to insert between those 2 stitches, wrap our yarn like we're going to knit and pull that new stitch through, hold our needles parallel and put that new stitch on the needle. And then from this point, we just keep repeating this process, inserting between the closest 2 stitches to the tip of our needle, bringing a new stitch through and putting that on the needle. That's all there is to this process. You just keep creating stitches until you cast on all of the stitches you need. And I don't like to tighten up on the newest stitch until I've inserted my needle for the next. That just makes it a little bit easier. So just keep going until you've cast on all the stitches you need for your hat size. Once you cast on all the stitches you need, it's time to join and work in the round. So just check, make sure your stitches aren't twisted all around the needle. Place a marker to mark the beginning of the round between that last cast on stitch and the first. Check one more time, and then I like to grab the tail and hold it double with the working yarn to knit the very first stitch, and that closes up the gap just a little bit. So I hold them together, and the pattern we're following is knit 2, purl 2 for this first row. So I knit that first stitch with the tail and the working yarn, give it a little tug and hold it firmly. Then I can drop the tail and continue knitting and purling across the row. So I'm going to knit 1 more stitch, then I'm going to purl 2 and then repeat that pattern until I've come back around to my marker. Knit 2, purl 2 all the way around. And when you get to the very first stitch again, it will look like there's 2 stitches coming out of that first stitch you created because you held that yarn double. And you're going to want to treat them just like 1 stitch. So just continue knitting and purling until you come back to that stitch marker. So we're back to our beginning of round. It's time to stop and make sure nothing's twisted, that our first row looks just fine, and we can start with our next row. And it starts with a purl 1. So we're going to treat that first stitch that we worked with the yarn tail held double, work it as 1 stitch. So we're purling those 2 together. And now we can continue our pattern. We're going to knit 2, purl 2, but that 1 purl stitch is at the beginning has offset our pattern. So we have a mistake rib pattern, and you'll see this pattern develop after you work a few rows. So just continue following the pattern until your cuff or the brim of the hat is as long as you want it to be. I'm finishing up the brim or the cuff on my hat, my little section of mistake stitch rib, and now it's time to start working the body of the hat, and I'm going to work it on a larger needle size. I used a US 9 for the brim, and I'm going to knit around the stitches on this first round following the pattern and just knit all of the stitches right onto my new needle size. I'm not going to slip any stitches or transfer anything. I'm just going to knit them right off the 9s right onto the 10s. So this is a plain knit round. You're just going to knit around, transferring those stitches to your new needle size. And then once you've finished with that US 9, you can set it aside and place your marker again for the beginning of round. It'll stay in the same place. And then just check and make sure everything looks right, nothing got twisted, everything looks good. Okay, so we're ready to start our pattern. I've already knit the first stitch just to hold my marker in place, but then we're going to follow the next instruction, and that is to slip a stitch. We're holding the yarn to the back of the work, we're slipping a stitch, and we're going to knit 3 and repeat that process. Slip 1 stitch purlwise, you're just slipping it from one tip to the other tip. Knit 3, slip 1, knit 3. You're just going to repeat this process to the last few stitches where you will slip 1 and then just knit 2. And here we are coming to the end of our round, so we've got our final knit 3. Now we can slip a stitch and then knit those final 2 stitches, and that was round 1 of our pattern. And round 2 is exactly the same. You're just going to follow that same pattern. We knit 1, we slip 1, and then we continue that knit 3, slip 1 until we finish the second round as well. And now comes the really fun part. We're going to work our cable crossing row. So knit 1, and now let's work our first left cross cable. We're going to slip that slipped stitch, drop it right off your needle. Knit the next 2 stitches, and then pick that stitch back up and finish knitting it. And that creates our first cable crossing. This is a left cross. So you want to pay attention to your slipped stitches because that's what we're dropping off the needle. So we knit 1, we repeat that process. We drop that slipped stitch that we've been slipping these last 2 rows right off the needle. We knit 2, we pick that stitch back up and we knit it. And we just continue this process across the round. We knit 1 stitch and then we repeat our cable crossing, slipping that stitch right off our needle, knitting 2, and then picking it back up and knitting it. You can see it's not really going anywhere. We've been slipping it for 2 rows, so it's elongated now and it's just going to hang out there. So that will get you set up, and you'll just continue following the written instructions or the charts, following the instructions, slipping stitches when you're instructed to, and you'll start to see that they are sort of lining up on top of each other. So you'll always have a good idea of where those stitches should be slipped. You can see that they sort of come out of each other. They're lining up all together. So you're just going to continue following the pattern. You've got some plain knit rounds and then more rounds where you're slipping stitches. And then we're going to cross some stitches in the other direction. We're going to do some right cross cables after we slip some more of these stitches. And one thing you can pay attention to as you're working that second round of slipping the stitch, if you're not sure if you're in the right stitch, just turn your work around and look. There'll be a strand of yarn that's not connected to that stitch that you slipped. It's connected to the stitch on either side, but not the slipped stitch. So on your second round of slipping stitches, if you're not quite sure which stitch should be slipped, that's the stitch that you're looking for, where it's not connected to the other stitches on either side of it. And then on round 7, we're going to do some more cable crossings, but this time they're going to lean off to the right. So I've already knit my first 3 stitches, and now it's time for that cross. So we're going to slip these 2 stitches that we're not going to work just yet to the back of our work on a cable needle. We're going to knit that slipped stitch and then pick up those stitches that we moved to the back, get them back on our needle, get the yarn out of the way, and then we'll knit those 2 stitches. And this is a right cross cable. So we want to pay attention because that slipped stitch is the one that has to be held and moved to the right. So then we're going to knit 5 stitches and repeat that process. And you'll do this for the whole round until you have worked all of those stitches. So it's those 3 stitches, 2 stitches in front of the slipped stitch, get transferred to our cable needle, and we hold it to the back of the work. We knit that slipped stitch, and then we want to work those 2 stitches that we have moved to the back. So we move them back to our needle and we knit them. And you can also do this cable crossing without transferring the stitches back to your main needle. So I've transferred the stitches to a cable needle. I've knit the stitch, but instead of moving them back to my main needle, I'm just going to slide them down the cable needle and knit them right from there. And it just saves you a step. It's just another way that you can do the same exact cable crossing without moving your stitches so often. So let's repeat that one more time. We'll knit 5, and we'll repeat that crossing. So we'll move those 2 stitches to a cable needle, hold them to the back of the work while we knit our slipped stitch, and then we can knit them directly from the cable needle without transferring them. And we can also work them without a cable needle altogether. After we finish this one, I will demonstrate that as well. Okay, to knit it without a cable needle, we have to grab that stitch that we want to have moving to the right, that slipped stitch. We're going to grab it from the front, just pick it up by that leg, and then we're going to slide all 3 of those stitches right off the left needle. We're sort of pinching them in place so they're not going to go anywhere. We bring our left needle in behind and we grab those 2 stitches that are just sort of hanging out there. Now we've got those picked up, and then we can transfer that slipped stitch back to the left needle. And now they're in the order we want to work them, so we can just knit right across all 3 stitches. And that's how you make that cable crossing without even using a cable needle. Let's do that one more time. So we'll knit 5, and then we want to grab that leg of the stitch that was slipped from the front. So bring your right needle around, pick that up, slip all 3 stitches right off the left needle, and then bring your left needle to the back to pick up those 2 stitches. Transfer that stitch over and then just knit them just as you normally would. And they've all been reordered, so they're in the proper order that they should be for their cable crossing. Now you're just going to keep following your pattern until you come to rounds 14 and 15. And we have a small adjustment to make here just to maintain the pattern around that beginning and end of round. On round 14, you're not going to work that final stitch. Instead, you're just going to slip it to the right needle, remove the marker, slip it back to the left needle, and replace the marker. We're just moving the beginning of round just for one single round. That's what that arrow at the end of the chart means. Then we can start our right cross cable on round 15 right away. So we're going to work round 15, which is very similar to a round that we worked earlier, but we just need to move that marker to slightly change the beginning of round. And then on round 15, after we've come to the end of that round, we're going to move that marker back where it was before we moved it on round 14. So we worked our last crossing. Now we're going to knit 5, remove that marker, knit one more stitch, and then replace that marker, and then we're back to our original beginning of round, and we can continue in our pattern for the rest of the hat. And when the body of the hat is as long as you want it, it is time to work our decreases. And we're going to do some quick decreases. I'm just knitting 2 together all the way around on this first decrease round. And then of course we are going to have to switch to double pointed needles or some other method for knitting that small circumference in the round because we don't have enough stitches for our 16-inch circular. So I'm removing our ring marker and I'm going to just place a marker right on a stitch so I'll know where our beginning of round is for our next decrease round. So after working that decrease round, we have a plain round of knitting. So I'm just going to knit all of these stitches directly over to my double pointed needles. So I'll just start knitting. They're the same size needles as I used for the body of the hat. I'm using US 10s, and I'm just going to knit this round, and when this knitting needle is full, I'll grab the next double pointed needle. And of course, if you really dislike double pointed needles, you could use another method for knitting small circumferences in the round. Perhaps you prefer magic loop or 2 circulars or some other method, but this is just one that I prefer. That's enough stitches there, so I'm going to grab the next double pointed needle and then just continue knitting until I've transferred all of my stitches to these double pointed needles. So we've transferred all of our stitches to our double pointed needles, and now it's time to do another decrease round. You can see I've got that marker telling me where my beginning of round is, and this is our second decrease round, and we're going to do just like we did for the first. We're going to knit 2 together all the way around, and that will decrease our stitch count by half again. So I like to just pull on that first one just to make sure it's staying nice and firm and not creating a ladder right there along that point where those 2 needles meet. And now I'm just going to knit 2 together all the way around these stitches on this first needle. And if there's an extra stitch or something, I can transfer it to the next one, but it looks like my stitch count is going to be exact on this one. Now I have an empty needle, so I will switch those needles around and continue working across this needle, knitting 2 together. And 1 more needle to work across. So we have finished our second decrease round, and I'm just going to knit 1 more round around all of these stitches, and then we are going to work 2 more decrease rounds. It's time for our third decrease round, and we're going to do just as we did for the other 2. We're going to knit 2 together all the way around and decrease our stitch count by half again. And on this needle I have 1 odd stitch, so I need to transfer it to another needle. So I'm just going to slide it right over to this needle so I can continue working my decreases. And I'm just going to continue right around for 1 more round, our final decrease round, to get our stitch count back down to a very small number so we can just close up the top. And when the decreases are all complete, we're just going to cut the yarn tail, thread it onto a tapestry needle, and then these final few stitches you're just going to slip off the needle and slide onto that tapestry needle, running that yarn tail through all of the stitches to close the top of the hat. And that's all there is to it. Once they're all transferred, you can tighten up the very top crown. I like to run through all of the stitches again to make sure that they are really held tightly, and then just tighten it up and then run that yarn tail to the inside, and then I can weave in the ends. To weave in the end along the brim of the hat, I just thread my tapestry needle and run it up one of the legs of that stockinette stitch on the inside. Then I sort of do one duplicate stitch around the top and then down the other leg of that stockinette stitch. It's stockinette on this side, but on the other side it's a purl stitch, so you're not going to see where you've woven in that tail. And that's usually enough to secure, unless it's very slippery yarn. And you'll want to weave in the tail on the crown of the hat as well. And I just do a little bit of duplicate stitch or wherever it looks like it'll just hold it nice and evenly along the top. Now you know everything there is to know about knitting this hat, and if you haven't gotten your copy of the pattern yet, you can find it linked down below this video, but there's actually more that we could discuss about knitting hats. Blocking hats, different yarns that you can use for hats, the different ways that you join to work in the round, or you can work different ways of decreasing. There's lots to discuss. So if you're ready to dive into those topics, click this video right here, and I'll see you in that next video.